Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you inspiring tales of love, resilience, and the human spirit. In today's story, Michael Hayes, a man with everything: a thriving career, wealth, and status, finds himself questioning the very foundation of his success. A staged crisis reveals not only the true colors of those closest to him but also leads him to an unexpected connection with Leah, a woman whose kindness changes his life forever. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to join us on this heartfelt journey. Let's begin today's story and uncover the lessons waiting within. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as I sat in the corner of the cozy Broadway cafe, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the tall windows. It was my 30th birthday, but there was no celebration, no excitement. Just me, a lukewarm cup of coffee, and the faint hum of jazz playing in the background. My sharp navy blue suit felt stiff from a day packed with meetings, and I couldn't help but glance at my watch for what must have been the third time in 10 minutes. David, my childhood best friend, was supposed to meet me here. I'd cleared my entire evening for this, rearranging my tight schedule to sit in this little cafe we used to frequent back when life was simpler, before success came at the cost of everything else. But now, as the minutes ticked by, it was clear he wasn't coming. A deep sigh escaped me as I leaned back in the chair, trying to ignore the growing annoyance bubbling beneath the surface. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like a refill?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see a young woman standing by my table, a coffee pot in one hand and a warm, easy smile on her face. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and though her uniform was plain, there was something genuine about her presence that made the moment feel less dreary. "Sure. Thanks," I said, pushing my cup forward. Her hands were steady as she poured, a small gesture in the midst of a day that felt like it was spiraling into disappointment. "Long day?" she asked lightly, her tone inviting without prying. "You could say that," I replied with a forced smile. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, "Actually, it's my birthday. I was supposed to meet someone, but plans seem to have changed." Her eyes lit up with surprise. "Happy birthday," she said, her enthusiasm catching me off guard. "Spending it here though? That's unique." "It wasn't the plan." I gestured vaguely to the empty chair across from me. "But I guess life has a sense of humor." She laughed softly, a sound so genuine it made me realize how long it had been since I'd shared a moment like this. "Well, happy birthday anyway," she said again, her smile lingering. "I hope the day surprises you in a good way before it's over." "Thanks, Leah," I said, noticing her name tag. "Anytime," she replied with a wink before walking away, as I watched her move gracefully through the cafe, tending to customers with the same warmth she'd shown me. I felt oddly comforted. It wasn't much, a brief conversation with a stranger, but somehow, it took the edge off my frustration. The faint buzz of my phone interrupted my thoughts. Picking it up, I saw David's name on the screen. For a fleeting second, I felt a rush of hope, only for it to dissolve as I heard his hurried, apologetic voice. "Mike, I'm so sorry. Man, something came up at the restaurant. One of my chefs didn't show, and we're slammed tonight. Rain check." I clenched my jaw, keeping my tone measured. "Yeah, sure. Don't worry about it. Thanks, buddy. I owe you one." He hung up before I could reply, leaving me staring at the empty chair across from me. For all my success, a thriving company, a luxurious penthouse apartment, and Samantha, a fiancée who could grace the cover of any magazine, why did it feel like I was always alone? "Excuse me." Leah's voice broke through my thoughts again. She stood nearby, holding a small plate. "I noticed you haven't touched your coffee. Everything okay?" I glanced at the plate in her hand. On it was a slice of chocolate cake, the frosting rich and inviting. "What's this?" "Consider it a birthday gift," she said with a shrug, placing it on the table. "Everyone deserves something sweet on their day." For the first time that evening, a genuine smile tugged at my lips. "Thank you, Leah. That's really kind of you." "It's just cake," she replied with a playful grin. "But I hope it helps a little." She walked away, leaving me staring at the slice of cake. My chest tightened. Not from the gesture itself, but from the realization of how long it had been since someone had done something kind for me without expecting anything in return. In the world I lived in, every action, every word, every glance was calculated. There were no simple acts of kindness. Yet, here I was, reminded of something I hadn't felt in years: connection. The cafe's buzz softened as the evening wore on. I stayed longer than I'd intended. The cake long gone, but the warmth of that small moment still lingering. When I finally stood to leave, I approached the counter where Leah was tidying up. "Leah," I said, catching her attention. "Thanks for the cake. And the coffee. And just, for being you, I guess." She looked surprised but smiled again. "You're welcome, Michael. Have a good night. And happy birthday." Again. As I stepped into the cool night air, the ache in my chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow. I glanced back at the cafe, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, and allowed myself a rare moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the day hadn't been a total loss. The night air was cool as I walked through the streets of New York. The city bustling around me. Cars honked. People rushed by. And the world seemed to move at a pace I couldn't quite match. The quiet corner of the Broadway cafe felt like a distant memory now, its warmth fading as I returned to my life, a life that should have been perfect, but somehow wasn't. The elevator ride to my penthouse was silent except for the faint hum of the machinery. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the vast expanse of glass and marble that I called home. The space was stunning, sleek, and designed for someone who had made it. But as I tossed my keys onto the counter and loosened my tie, it felt cold, empty, and more like a stage set than a sanctuary. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the soft glow of the city lights. Taking a sip, I sank onto the leather couch and stared out at the skyline. New York sprawled before me, glittering and alive, a stark contrast to the hollowness I felt inside. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me from my thoughts. Samantha. The message was as polished as she was. "Happy birthday, darling. Can't wait to celebrate this weekend. Love you." The words felt like they'd been copy-pasted from every birthday greeting she'd sent over the past 3 years. No mention of my day. No curiosity about how I was feeling. Just another perfectly crafted message to maintain appearances. I typed a brief response: "Thanks. Can't wait," and set the phone down, my chest tightening. Samantha was everything the world told me I should want. Beautiful, intelligent, poised. She fit seamlessly into the image I'd built. The life I was supposed to live. But was it real? Or was she just another piece of the puzzle, chosen to complete the picture without considering the person behind it? My mind wandered back to Leah. Her laughter. Her warmth. The simple act of bringing me that cake. There was no agenda. No calculation. Just genuine kindness. In those brief moments, she'd seen me. Not the polished exterior or the accolades, but the person behind it all. It was unsettling and refreshing all at once. The sharp ring of my phone shattered the quiet. My father's name lit up the screen, and I hesitated before answering. "Michael," he said, his voice as measured and firm as always. "Happy birthday. I trust it's been productive." "Thanks, Dad," I replied, already bracing myself. With him, there was no such thing as a simple conversation. "Good. Listen. I wanted to discuss Samantha. It's been almost 2 years since your engagement. Don't you think it's time to finalize things? Her family is influential, Michael. Their connections could be invaluable to the business." I clenched my jaw. I didn't realize my engagement was a corporate merger. "Don't be dramatic," he said, his tone dismissive. You and Samantha are a good match. She understands our world, our lifestyle. You need someone like her by your side. What if she doesn't love me for who I am? I shot back, my frustration breaking through. There was a long pause on the other end. That's nonsense, he said finally. Samantha is devoted to you. Stop doubting everything and focus on what's important. The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand. My father had always been the architect of my life, steering me toward success with unwavering precision. But his definition of success had come at a cost, one I was no longer sure I was willing to pay. The next morning, the world moved as it always did, and I found myself back in the thick of it. Meetings, phone calls, and endless demands filled the hours. But my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying my conversation with my father, the questions it had stirred, and the ache it left behind. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted. But the thought of going home to that empty penthouse was unbearable. Without thinking, I found myself walking back to the cafe. The warmth of its interior greeted me as I stepped inside. And there she was, Leah, moving effortlessly behind the counter. When she saw me, her face lit up with that same easy smile. Back so soon, she teased. You're going to make people think you're addicted to coffee. Maybe I'm addicted to the company, I replied, surprising myself with the lightness in my tone. She laughed, the sound as comforting as the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Well, in that case, I guess I'll allow it. What can I get you? Surprise me, I said, leaning against the counter. Leah grinned and got to work, her movements quick and assured. A few minutes later, she handed me a steaming cup, hazelnut latte with a hint of caramel. Trust me, it'll make your night better. I took a sip, the rich flavors warming me instantly. You weren't kidding. This is amazing. Of course it is, she said with a playful shrug. I made it. We both laughed. And for the first time in days, the weight on my chest felt lighter. There was something about Leah's presence that made the world feel a little less overwhelming. She didn't ask about my work or my fiancé or my success. She just saw me. And somehow, that was enough. As the evening wore on, I lingered longer than I should have, reluctant to leave the warmth of the cafe and the ease of our conversation. But eventually, it was time to go. As I stepped back into the cool night air, I couldn't help but glance back. Leah waved from the window, her smile lingering in my mind long after I'd turned away. Something about that night felt different, as if the carefully constructed walls of my life were starting to crack. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to rebuild them. The following days blurred into a series of obligations. Meetings, reports, and endless phone calls dominated my time. Yet my mind kept wandering. It wasn't just the strain of the business or the constant pressure from my father that weighed on me. It was the quiet moments, the memory of Leah's laughter, her genuine kindness, the way she'd made me feel seen. I hadn't realized how much I was missing that authenticity for so long. I'd been surrounded by people who operated on calculation and gain. Even Samantha, with her perfect poise, felt like an accessory to the life my father envisioned for me rather than a true partner. But Leah, she was different. She brought warmth to spaces that felt cold and lifeless. And somehow, in her simplicity, she made everything else seem complicated. By Thursday evening, I found myself back at the cafe. It was unplanned, almost instinctual, like a compass leading me to something I didn't fully understand yet. Leah was there, as always, bustling around the counter with that same energy. When she spotted me, she smiled, her expression tinged with surprise. 3 times in a week, she teased, wiping her hands on her apron. You're becoming a regular. What can I say? I replied with a grin. The coffee's good. The company's better. She laughed, and the sound felt like a salve to the chaos in my life. Well, you're in luck. I just made fresh banana bread. Want a slice? Absolutely. She brought it over with a steaming mug of coffee, sitting down across from me this time. "You look like you've had a rough day," she said, her voice softer now. "What's going on?" I hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. In my world, people didn't ask questions like that, not unless they wanted leverage. But with Leah, there was no agenda, just genuine concern. "It's complicated," I said finally, staring into my coffee. "Work, family, life. It feels like everything is spinning out of control, and I can't figure out how to stop it." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Sounds like a lot to carry, but you don't have to figure it all out at once. You know, sometimes it's enough to take things one step at a time." Her words were simple, yet they resonated deeply. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you, Leah." She tilted her head, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" "You're just real," I said, struggling to put it into words. "You don't pretend to be something you're not. You don't play games. You just are." She smiled at that, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. "Well, I don't think anyone's ever called me real before, but I'll take it as a compliment." "It is," I assured her. "A big one." The cafe door chimed as another customer walked in, breaking the moment. Leah excused herself to help them, leaving me with my thoughts. I watched her work, moving with ease and warmth, and I couldn't help but wonder what my life would look like if it had more of her in it. When she returned, we talked about everything and nothing: her dream of opening a bakery, my favorite spots in the city, and the little things that made us both feel alive. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. By the time I left, the city was quiet, the streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights. I walked slowly, savoring the rare sense of peace. But as I neared my building, the weight of reality began to settle again. The elevator ride to my penthouse felt heavier than usual, each floor bringing me closer to the life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. When I stepped inside, the space felt colder than ever. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw Samantha's name. I hesitated before picking it up. "Michael," she said, her voice crisp and practiced. "I was just thinking about the gala next weekend. Have you decided which suit you're wearing? My mother insists it matches my dress." I closed my eyes, the disconnect between us sharper than ever. "I haven't thought about it," I said, my voice devoid of energy. "Well, think about it soon," she replied, her tone light but firm. "We need to look coordinated." "Of course," I said automatically, though my chest tightened at the thought. As the call ended, I set the phone down and rubbed my temples. This was my life, planned, polished, and completely detached from anything real. And for the first time, I questioned whether I could keep living it. The next morning, I woke to a sense of resolve I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't keep ignoring the doubts gnawing at me. Something had to change, and I wasn't sure what that meant for my career, my engagement, or the life my father had built for me. But I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't willing to lose the small flicker of light Leah had sparked in me. Not yet. Not without seeing where it could lead. The weekend arrived, and with it came the gala, a grand affair hosted by one of the city's elite to showcase power, wealth, and influence. I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting the perfectly tailored black tuxedo that Samantha had insisted on. The reflection staring back at me looked every part the successful CEO my father had molded me to be. But inside, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. Samantha was already waiting in the car when I stepped outside. Her silver gown shimmered under the streetlights, her polished smile firmly in place. She looked perfect, as always. But there was something distant about her. Something I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps I had, and I was only now willing to admit it. "You're late," she said, though her tone was playful. "You know my parents hate waiting." "Sorry," I replied, sliding into the seat beside her. "It's been a long week." She glanced at me, her perfectly arched brow lifting slightly. I noticed. "You've been distracted. Is something going on?" I hesitated, debating whether to tell her the truth. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Samantha wasn't the kind of person to dig beneath the surface. She thrived on appearances. And the idea of confronting the cracks in our relationship wasn't part of her carefully curated world. "Just work," I said finally, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The gala was everything I expected: elegant, extravagant, and utterly hollow. The room buzzed with the murmur of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of forced laughter. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. But my heart wasn't in it. Samantha's parents were stationed near the center of the room, holding court with a small group of their peers. When we approached, her mother's sharp eyes scanned me, as if evaluating whether I still met their standards. "Michael," she said, her smile tight. "How wonderful to see you again. I trust the company is doing well?" "It's been a challenging year," I admitted, though my tone remained measured. "But we're making progress." Her father, Richard, gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Progress is important. Just make sure you don't lose sight of what's at stake." His words were a reminder of the unspoken expectations that had always hung over me. To them, I wasn't just Samantha's fiancé, I was an extension of their family's legacy, a piece in their game of influence. As the night dragged on, I found myself drifting toward the edges of the room, away from the polished facades and shallow conversations. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Leah's name. "Hope tonight isn't too boring," her message read, accompanied by a winking emoji. "Let me know if you survive." I couldn't help but smile, the tension in my chest easing slightly. "Barely surviving," I replied. "But your message just made it better." I could almost picture her laughing as she read it. And for a moment, the noise of the gala faded into the background. "Who's that?" Samantha's voice cut through the moment, sharp and curious. I quickly slipped my phone back into my pocket. "Just a work message," I said, keeping my tone casual. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the crowd. "Don't forget the auction," she said, her voice tight. "We need to make an impression." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of obligations, each interaction leaving me more drained than the last. By the time we returned to my penthouse, I felt like a shell of myself. Samantha kicked off her heels and sank onto the couch, scrolling through her phone as if the night had taken no toll on her. I poured myself a glass of scotch, the burn in my throat grounding me as I stared out at the city. My phone buzzed again, and this time I didn't hesitate to check it. "If you ever need rescuing, you know where to find me," Leah's message read. I chuckled softly, the corners of my mouth lifting despite the heaviness of the evening. "I might take you up on that," I replied. Samantha glanced up from her phone, her expression curious. "Who are you texting at this hour?" "Just Margaret," I lied smoothly, taking another sip of my drink. She needed clarification on a report. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her scrolling. But as I stood there, watching her, I felt the weight of our disconnect settle over me like a storm cloud. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear: I couldn't keep living a life that felt so far from who I really was. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it might look like to choose something different, to choose someone different. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting long shadows on the sleek, modern decor. The remnants of the previous night's gala still clung to me, a sense of exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. Samantha had left early, muttering something about meeting her mother, and I found myself alone in the silence of my apartment. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I picked it up to find a message from Margaret. "We need to talk. Call me when you're free." I sighed, already anticipating the nature of the conversation. Margaret didn't sugarcoat anything, and her texts were never casual. I dialed her number and waited as the line connected. "Michael," she answered, her voice as sharp and direct as ever. "Victor Reed is making moves again. He's been meeting with some of our key clients. And the rumors about our company's instability are spreading faster than we anticipated." My grip on the phone tightened. Victor had been circling like a vulture, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit any perceived weakness. "What's the plan?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm. "We've set up meetings with the board and the clients he's targeting," Margaret replied. "But you need to address this head-on. People need to see confidence from you, not hesitation." "Understood," I said, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on my chest. "Let's get it done." As the call ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was fighting a battle on multiple fronts. The corporate world was ruthless, and Victor's underhanded tactics were a stark reminder of how easily everything I'd built could come crashing down. But even as my professional life demanded my attention, my thoughts kept drifting to Leah. Later that afternoon, I found myself driving toward the cafe, drawn there by something I couldn't quite explain. The small, unassuming shop had become a refuge in recent weeks, a place where the pressures of my world seemed to fade, if only temporarily. When I walked in, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted me, along with the sight of Leah behind the counter. She looked up and smiled, her expression brightening as she saw me. "Back so soon?" she teased, her eyes sparkling. "People are going to start thinking you're addicted to caffeine." "Maybe I'm addicted to something else," I replied, the words slipping out before I could think better of them. Her cheeks flushed, but she laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What can I get you today?" she asked, changing the subject but not quite meeting my gaze. "Surprise me," I said, leaning against the counter. "You always seem to know what I need." As she prepared my drink, I watched her move with a quiet confidence that felt so different from the polished, calculated demeanor of the people I usually surrounded myself with. Leah was real, unpretentious, and utterly disarming. When she handed me the steaming cup, I took a sip and nodded appreciatively. "Perfect. As always." "It's just coffee," she said. But her smile hinted at something more. I lingered longer than I intended, the conversation flowing effortlessly. We talked about everything and nothing. From her plans for the bakery she dreamed of opening to my vague mentions of the challenges I was facing at work. She never pressed for details, but her genuine curiosity and empathy made it easy to open up in ways I hadn't with anyone else. "I don't know how you stay so positive," I said at one point, my voice tinged with admiration. "You've got so much on your plate. But you're always smiling." She shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "Life's hard enough without letting it steal your joy. And besides, there's always something to be grateful for." Her words lingered with me long after I left the cafe. Driving back to my office, I couldn't help but compare Leah's authenticity to the shallow interactions that dominated my days. With her, I felt grounded, like I could finally breathe. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and damage control. Victor's shadow loomed large, but Margaret and I were relentless in our efforts to counter his schemes. Late one night, after a particularly grueling strategy session, I found myself reaching for my phone. Still awake, I texted Leah. Her response came almost immediately. "Always. What's up?" "Just needed a distraction." "What are you doing?" "Baking," she replied, followed by a photo of a tray of cookies fresh out of the oven. "Want to help taste test?" Before I knew it, I was standing outside her apartment, the warmth of her home spilling onto the street as she opened the door. The simplicity of the moment, the smell of sugar and vanilla, the sound of her laughter was a balm to my frayed nerves. As we sat at her small kitchen table, sharing cookies and stories, I realized something profound. Leah didn't just make me feel better, she made me feel whole. In a world where so much was uncertain, she was the one thing I could count on. But as the night wore on, the weight of my responsibilities returned, reminding me that my battle with Victor and the truth about my feelings for Leah was far from over. The following morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. The sunlight streaming through the windows hinted at a day already in motion, and the tension I'd momentarily escaped last night came rushing back. It was Margaret. Her voice was clipped and urgent. "Michael, we've got a development. Victor's made contact with 3 more of our key clients. He's offering aggressive terms, undercutting us at every turn." I sat up, running a hand through my hair. "How serious is it?" "Serious enough that the board is demanding a response," she replied. "They want a meeting by this afternoon. They're expecting a clear plan to counter this." Her words landed heavily, the weight of the stakes pressing on me. "Set it up," I said finally, "and pull together all the leverage we have on Reed Holdings. It's time to take the gloves off." By the time I arrived at the office, Margaret had already compiled an exhaustive dossier on Victor's recent activities. As I pored over the data, a grim picture emerged. Victor wasn't just undermining us, he was betting everything on our collapse. His offers to our clients were unsustainable, built on the shaky foundation of his own company's precarious finances. If we exposed him at the right moment, his entire operation would crumble. But timing was everything. One misstep, and I risked looking vindictive or worse, desperate. The board meeting was tense. As I entered the room, their expressions ranged from concerned to outright skeptical. Alan Grant, one of the senior members, spoke first. "Michael, we've been hearing troubling things. Clients are nervous. And frankly, so are we. What's the plan?" I met his gaze, refusing to let the doubt in his tone unsettle me. "The plan," I began, "is to expose Victor Reed for what he is, a manipulative opportunist whose empire is crumbling under its own weight." I gestured toward the screen at the front of the room, where Margaret had prepared a detailed presentation. The financial data laid bare the fragility of Reed Holdings, from mounting debts to unsustainable loans. Gasps rippled through the room as the implications became clear. "If we move decisively," I continued, "we can not only reassure our clients but also solidify our position as the stronger, more stable choice." The murmurs of the board grew louder, the initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. Alan leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "It's bold, but it just might work." As the meeting adjourned, I felt a renewed sense of determination. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, it felt winnable. That evening, as the city lights glittered outside my office window, my thoughts drifted to Leah. In the chaos of the day, I hadn't had a chance to reach out to her, but the memory of her laughter the night before lingered like a balm. Without thinking, I picked up my phone and sent her a message. "Busy?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Never too busy for you. What's up?" I smiled, the tension in my chest easing. "Can I see you? It's been a long day." When I arrived at her apartment, the sight of her standing in the doorway, dressed casually in jeans and a cozy sweater, was enough to make the weight of the day melt away. She smiled, stepping aside to let me in. "You look like you could use some tea," she said, heading toward the kitchen. "And maybe a cookie or two." "Tea sounds perfect," I said, following her. As she bustled around, I leaned against the counter, watching her with quiet appreciation. "Rough day?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Rough week," I admitted. "But being here, it helps." She looked up, her expression softening. "You know, you don't always have to be the guy with all the answers. It's okay to let people in." Her words struck a chord, and for a moment, I found myself wanting to tell her everything. About Victor, the staged crisis, the pressure from the board, But I held back, unsure of how much she could or should carry. Instead, I said, "You make it easier to forget the noise, Leah. And that's something I didn't know I needed." Her cheeks flushed, but she smiled, reaching for the mugs of tea. "Well, I'm glad I can help." We spent the evening talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly as it always did. When I finally left, the weight of the day felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope that everything might just work out. But as I drove back to my penthouse, the thought of Victor's relentless scheming reminded me that the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought and decisions to be made. And Leah, whether she realized it or not, was becoming an increasingly important part of the future I was fighting for. The next morning arrived with a faint drizzle, the kind that left the city shimmering under a grey sky. I stood by the window in my office, watching as rain streaked down the glass, each drop a reminder of the storm still brewing around me. My phone buzzed on the desk, pulling me back to reality. It was Margaret. "Victor's making his move," she said without preamble. "We just got word that he's scheduled a private dinner with two of our biggest clients. If he sways them, it could trigger a domino effect." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Do we have confirmation on the venue?" "Yes. The Grayson Club. 8 tonight." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. Victor's timing was no accident. He wanted to create doubt before we could regain full control of the narrative. "We can't let him win," I said. "I'll handle it." Margaret hesitated before responding. "Michael, this could backfire. Showing up uninvited might look desperate. Or it might show them I'm not afraid to fight for what's mine." I countered. "We can't let Victor dictate the terms." As the day wore on, I prepared for the confrontation, reviewing every detail of our recent victories and assembling the evidence that would expose Victor's lies. By the time evening arrived, my resolve was unshakable. When I entered the Grayson Club, the atmosphere was as exclusive as ever. Low lighting, muted conversations, and the faint clinking of crystal glasses created an ambience of quiet power. I spotted Victor immediately, seated at a corner table with the two clients he was courting. His smile was wide, his gestures confident. But as his gaze flickered to me, I saw a flash of unease. "Michael," Victor said smoothly as I approached the table. "What a surprise." I returned his smile, though mine lacked warmth. "Victor, I couldn't resist stopping by when I heard you were entertaining some of our mutual acquaintances." The two clients, Greg and Linda, exchanged glances, their curiosity evident. Greg, always the more direct of the two, gestured for me to sit. "Well, since you're here, why don't you join us?" "Michael, we were just discussing some interesting opportunities." "Of course," I said, taking the empty seat across from Victor. I'd hate to miss out on a discussion about the future. Victor's jaw tightened, but he maintained his polished demeanor. We were just exploring possibilities, as any savvy businesspeople would. Possibilities are always worth exploring. I agreed, leaning back in my chair, but it's important to have all the facts before making decisions. I reached into my briefcase, pulling out the dossier Margaret and I had compiled. Sliding it across the table, I added, "This might provide some additional context to your discussions." Linda opened the folder first, her eyes widening as she scanned the documents. Greg leaned over to read, his expression darkening with each page. Victor, meanwhile, sat frozen, his smile a brittle mask. This can't be right," Linda said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Victor, is this true?" Victor's composure cracked for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Michael's clearly desperate, throwing around half-truths to protect his sinking ship. "Sinking?" I echoed, my tone calm but cutting. "If that's the case, why are your own financials riddled with short-term loans and mounting debts? And why are you offering deals that your company can't sustain?" Greg closed the folder, fixing Victor with a hard stare. Is there anything you want to clarify? Victor. Victor's silence spoke volumes. I think we've seen enough, Linda said, standing abruptly. Thank you for your time, Victor. But I believe Michael has made his case. Greg nodded, rising as well. Michael. Let's set up a meeting next week to discuss moving forward. As they left, Victor glared at me, his mask slipping to reveal the fury beneath. You think this is over? He hissed. No, I said evenly, standing to leave. But you've lost. The drive home was quiet. The rain now a gentle patter against the windshield. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The battle wasn't over. But the tide had turned. Later that night, as I sat in my living room nursing a glass of wine, my phone buzzed. It was Leah. How did your evening go? I smiled, typing a reply. Better than I expected. Can I see you tomorrow? Her response was instant. Of course. Always. And in that moment, amidst the chaos and uncertainty of my life, her words felt like the calm I so desperately needed. The next morning, the city was bathed in golden light, the rain from the previous night giving way to clear skies. As I stepped into the cafe, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries greeted me like an old friend. Leah was behind the counter, her hair tied back in a loose braid, and a faint smudge of flour dusting her cheek. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to make the room brighter. Michael, she called, setting down a tray of muffins. Early today. Coffee or something stronger? Coffee's fine, I said, walking up to the counter. But I came for something else too. She raised an eyebrow. Curious. Oh. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice as though sharing a secret. A walk. Just you and me. There's something I need to talk about. Her smile softened, and she nodded. Let me finish up here. Give me 15 minutes. Take all the time you need. I sat near the window, watching as she worked with her usual mix of efficiency and kindness. She greeted every customer with warmth, her laughter spilling into the room like sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the cold, transactional world I'd grown so accustomed to. When she finally joined me, she had changed into a simple coat and scarf, her hair now falling freely over her shoulders. So, where are we going? She asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Just around, I said, holding the door open for her. I thought some fresh air might do us both good. We wandered through the park a few blocks from the cafe, the leaves still damp from the rain. The paths were quiet, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. I shoved my hands into my pockets, searching for the right words. Leah, I began, glancing at her. I owe you an explanation. She looked at me, her expression calm but attentive. About everything, I said with a sigh. My company, the mess I've been dealing with, even why I've been showing up at your cafe so much. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. I told her everything about Victor, the staged financial crisis, the doubts that had plagued me about Charlotte, and how the storm had nearly torn apart everything I'd worked for. Through it all, Leah listened, her silence encouraging me to keep going. I thought I had everything, I said finally, my voice quieter now. The success, the lifestyle, the relationships that looked perfect on the outside. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I started wondering if any of it was real. She stopped walking, turning to face me fully. And did you find your answer? I hesitated, my gaze locking with hers. Not until I met you. Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't look away. Michael, you showed me something I'd forgotten, I said, stepping closer. What it means to care without expectation. To find joy in the simple things. To be myself, without masks or pretense. Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead, she smiled, soft, genuine, and full of something I could only hope was mutual understanding. "You didn't need me to find that," she said quietly. "It was always there, Michael. You just needed someone to remind you." I reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Well, I'm grateful you did." We stood there for a while, the world around us fading into the background. It wasn't a grand moment, not the kind you see in movies or read about in books, but it was ours. Quiet, simple, and real. As we made our way back to the cafe, the air between us felt lighter, as though something unspoken had finally been understood. Before we parted, she placed a hand on my arm, her touch warm despite the crisp air. "Michael," she said, her tone serious but kind, "whatever happens next, just know that you don't have to face it alone." Her words stayed with me long after she was gone, echoing in my mind like a promise. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world on my own. And as I stepped back into the rhythm of my life, I knew one thing for certain: Leah wasn't just a part of my journey, she was the reason I was starting to believe in it again. And so, Michael's journey came full circle, not through the battles in the boardroom or the schemes of a rival, but through the quiet strength and genuine kindness of Leah. She reminded him of what truly mattered: love, authenticity, and the courage to embrace life's imperfections. Together, they started building a life filled with trust and simplicity, proving that sometimes the most profound victories happen in the heart. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible tales of resilience and transformation. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment. See you in the next story.